Hello, everybody, and welcome to our latest Google Hangout. We're doing this today with Dimension Data. The topic is exploring cloud maturity, and this is brought to you through sponsorship by Cisco and Dimension Data. Cisco, I should tell you, has granted Dimension Data a status as being one of their master cloud builders. We're very thankful for them to help us in creating this opportunity to engage in a dialogue. Joining me today, I'm Lane Cooper. I'm a contributing editor to CIO Magazine. And I've been tasked with the honor of moderating this discussion with Jason Cumberland. Jason, thank you for joining us today. He's a general manager of IaaS and Infrastructure as a Service with Dimension Data. Jason, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Thanks, Lane.
Also with us today is Troy Garrison, who is one of the solutions architects that's doing a lot of work in the cloud arena. Troy, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Lane.
You know, Troy, let me start with you, if I may. You know, we've seen rapid adoption of clouds. I think we're past now the early stages of what is cloud, should I use cloud, how should we be going about it. I think, if anything, we have a bit of cloud sprawl going on in the marketplace today. So my question to you is, how do we, what are you seeing as multiple clouds are rolled out? With or without the necessarily the involvement of IT organizations, how are you seeing cloud being managed today as the complexity rises across the stack of infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and internal private environments, hybrid environments, and public environments?
Yeah, so what we're seeing in the market is certainly software as a service is mature and it's been out there. People are using it. And what we're seeing is the dev and test environments are certainly getting more mature. Just about every company is utilizing cloud in some way in the dev and test. Also, the shadow IT and those other organizations outside of IT, especially in the marketing departments and other places, have gone around IT for cloud. Where we're seeing it maturing is now we're starting to see a growth in looking at production apps. That's still in the infancy stages, is what we're seeing on the full production apps going into the cloud.
Jason, what about yourself? You know, we have beyond that sort of early stages where we have a variety of different flavors going in there. It's always funny to me that we say, oh, we want to be careful going into the cloud, and yet the poster child for software as a service is Salesforce.com, which doesn't have anything important, just your customer data out there. But how are you seeing these different resources be managed as you engage with your clients to develop cloud strategies for your customers?
Sure, Lane. I think that one of the interesting things we see is that as clients over the past 4 to 5 years, depending on when they adopted cloud, they have taken a very cautious approach, like you said, of putting applications into the cloud. And so what happens is you have one application in a certain cloud provider, you have another one that's been pushed out to a different cloud provider, and then and those are the ones that the IT department knows about, and then you have 17 others that are completely unknown and elsewhere. And so in an effort that clients make to manage complexity and security and risk by pushing only piecemeal applications out at a time, we're often brought back in to have a conversation with clients about simplifying their architecture and their cloud security story, because in their effort to manage risk, they've actually created more risk, created more complexity. And so a lot of what we end up first doing with clients is helping them get an understanding of where are their applications in the cloud, and we have some interesting tools we use to do that, and then how do we get a strategy together that actually makes it more comprehensive for the IT department to roll back out. So there is a lot of complexity in the cloud today.
So to what extent is that understood? I mean, I think, and it must be different based on the size of the organization that you're dealing with, but just generally speaking, let's try to understand our profile here. So Jason, let me stay with you on that, and I'd like to hear from Troy on this as well. But how well do you think do different types of customers that you deal with, different types of enterprises, how aware are they of the sprawl of cloud that might exist within the organizations?
It depends on the maturity of the organization, and so we categorize the types of clients we work with really into 3 buckets, anywhere from the earliest adopters of cloud who were pushing production applications out 5 or 6 years ago to the late adopters. And if we look at the late adopters who would identify themselves in that category, they probably have the most surprise when we come in and start looking at where they are and what they're using in the cloud. And Troy, when we go over to you, I think it might be interesting for you to talk about the tools that we use that sit inside of a customer's environment and actually will identify for a CIO where all the cloud use is happening in the organization and how much is there. And so a lot of times we'll start an engagement with a client to try to give them visibility in what's happening in their organization. And it is sometimes a big eye-opener, Lane, to your point. But it allows us to really go back then and add value and say, okay, now let's, you have 100 servers in Amazon and another 50 over here. Let's go talk internally and see what are those servers doing and what's our level of exposure, and then bring a security wrapper around all that as a starting point, as a part of a plan to really rationalize cloud usage in an organization.
Troy, give us some insight into what do these tools look like? How do they work? How do you manage them? How effective are they in identifying what is really probably a pretty tough assignment to try to track down how people are bringing their own cloud to work?
Yeah, it really is, and we have to have a lot of tools to do it. So our consulting group uses multiple tools, but we use one by Risk Networks to go out and discover a customer's not only internal environments and virtualization, but out to other clouds as well. And what Jason just said, we just finished one this week, and the CIO was quite surprised to find that the number of servers they had in the cloud was double of what they had originally given us when they gave his verbal non-discovered assessment of what they had. So it actually was double of what he thought. So we utilize risk networks. We utilize tools from VMware. It depends on the enterprise, what network access we have within that. Most of our customers, you're asking about the clientele that we're doing this in. It's enterprise, it's smaller enterprise, $1 to $5 billion, and some in the commercial select. But I'd say a lot of it's the $1 to $5 billion customer in revenue that we're looking at and doing most of the work in these discoveries.
Troy, tell me how that works, though. Are there like central points of passage that give you a clue? I mean, I've heard of people reviewing receipts, credit card receipts, to see if they see any, any culprits there. What's the process? Where do you intercept and capture insight into where these cloud resources are being utilized?
Right, and we do have full consulting and business process consultants that will dive into what you're talking about, into the invoices and things like that. But the first layer we go into are really network tools, looking at the ingress points from the different locations, right? So all these customers have different means of connecting to the cloud, right? Whether it be site-to-site VPNs or they're extending their MPLS. So we look at the ingress, egress points, put those collectors in that tools and look for traffic going in and out. And then once we find it going to certain locations, then we start doing more assessment, digging in with our consultants to the dev group, where are all these, or to the marketing group, and we start getting deeper in that way. So it is a very manual process outside of the collection tools to really ferret out all of the different shadow IT and the sprawl that is happening in these large organizations.
So as I go to Jason with my next question, I want to tell our audience that I have my list of questions, but if you want to participate and try to stump my experts here, please feel free to chat in your questions, and I'll be happy to pass those on, and we can engage on this so that we can make this as relevant as possible for you. But Jason, one might suggest, one might think when we talk about a topic like this, cloud sprawl, that these are unauthorized or somehow, off the books or off the reservation sorts of activities. But in fact, the complexity may not be that people are engaged in rogue activity. It may just be that we're just not managing it correctly. To what extent is the sprawl sort of by design? In other words, people receive some sort of authorization to do this versus really sort of off the books, unauthorized, unknown, and therefore risk prone?
Good question, and it varies, Lane. So I think that, again, if you look at the companies who are probably the least mature in their use of cloud technologies, there may actually not be a policy internally at all about what's allowed for cloud usage or what isn't. And so in that case, it's well-intentioned people doing things that are entirely business appropriate that may be creating a really uncomfortable amount of risk for the organization. And that's usually where we try to focus in our assessments, is not pointing the finger as, who has done something out of bounds, or off the books, but really, and even, I guess, let's just take a step back. Sometimes CIO are concerned about cost, sometimes they're concerned about risk. And where we focus initially is usually about risk, which is what are you doing in the cloud and what data have you pushed out of there? Because in the last several years, the rules around data privacy in the US particularly have expanded a lot, particularly if you work in the healthcare industry or financial service industry. Financial services companies are not an example of companies that don't have policies around this. They're very strict and generally fairly well controlled. But if we look at healthcare, manufacturing, some of those, we do find data that's being pushed out into the cloud that shouldn't be there, and shouldn't be there without a really intentional security practice or security policy wrapped around it. So a lot of times we go directly from assessment to security and then move on from there.
Yeah. There's a little bit of a sense here, Troy, of closing the barn door after the animals have left, after the horses have gone out already.
Right.
And is this a case, Troy, where we need to sort of corral things in and then redevelop how it is that we move to cloud? In other words, is the first step really to make assessment, bring it back under control, and then begin the process of setting rules of engagement for how it is that an enterprise uses cloud resources?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a two-part thing there. So one is kind of what I started off with. A lot of this sprawl that you're seeing and a lot of the out of control is oftentimes with the dev and test organizations and the dev and test workloads. The production workloads haven't got out on cloud so rampant yet that they have to reel it in. What I'll say is they're maturing in their cloud strategies, right? So what they're talking to us about is, okay, we have this dev and test that we've kind of let go crazy because they can, right? It's really easy to spin up new instances in the cloud that we don't control. But now let's put a policy around, and we're starting to look at workloads and data, and so we need to have a multi-pronged approach to cloud, and that's where we're seeing them, the CIOs say, well, let's talk about private cloud, either in our data center or not, and let's talk about splitting workloads, right? So, okay, let's put policy around these type of apps are ERP apps and our production apps going where we can control a lot more of it, say in our data center in a private cloud, and we'll put policies in place with the private or the public cloud out there with the Amazons or the different public clouds out there, and rein that in. So they're starting to mature their policies because they're looking deeper into the stack with production.
So, Jason, why don't you follow up on this? Because I'd certainly like to sort of understand not only how we can better manage the cloud, but also preserve that flexibility, right? And one of the things that you want from your test and dev people is to be innovative, to go out there and take advantage of opportunity, to execute, and help bring new opportunities to market. But what is your view on sort of harnessing this without constraining it, if that makes sense?
Sure. I think that, as we've seen just from the questions you're asking, the complexity here is sometimes overwhelming for the enterprise audience. They're running large environments. They oftentimes have numerous physical data centers, and now they have 4 or 5 different cloud environments. And so as we come in and talk to the CIOs about how do we actually put a plan around this, we really have a 3-phased approach that we're talking about. We start with saying you first need to simplify, then you secure, and after that you accelerate. So just 3 things to remember: it's simplify, secure, and accelerate. And to kind of group the things Troy was talking about into those categories, the first thing we do around simplification is give the CIO visibility to the tools we mentioned. Then we bring in our consulting services group, if wanted, to talk about how do we actually build a comprehensive plan about how we should be using the cloud. Secure, as I've talked about next time, and we haven't, not to give a long commercial about Dimension Data, but we have $1 billion global managed security practice. And so most times when we talk about accelerating the use into cloud, we can take some of the savings that clients take by moving into a cloud environment and bring them back into actually improving security as they go into the cloud, as opposed to what most people think when they move into the cloud is that they lose security. So once we put a security wrapper around what we're going to do in the cloud, only then do we actually move forward with the client to start accelerating and how do they take advantage and drive some of the cost savings out. And unfortunately, most clients do that in the exact reverse order. They push a bunch of stuff into the cloud and then try to figure out how do we make it secure and how do we simplify it. So really, that's the process we try to bring back into clients' lane.
So Jason, I just want to follow up on what does it mean to simplify? I mean, it's easy to say.
Yep.
What does that mean? What is it?
Well,
what exactly does that mean?
I mean, I think that's why people ultimately engage a company like us, is because it's the hardest thing to do. So we talked a lot about bringing visibility, because until you know the size of the problem, it's really hard to solve for managing the complexity out of it. But one of the things that we do, and where the niche of the market that we work in, is with clients who want a partner who will provide managed services across both a cloud environment and a physical data center environment. Very few of our clients are going 100% to the cloud, and if you look at the $1 to $5 billion revenue space, that's just not realistic. And so what they want is to compress the number of vendors they work with down to a smaller group of people. And so they'll come in and ask Dimension Data, can you manage my on-premise EMC and Cisco environment just like you do the one in the cloud, so that what I can focus on as an organization is harnessing the benefits of agility, like you talked about. I want my developers to be able to spin up and shut down servers as needed, whether it's in my environment or yours, and I want you to worry about all that regardless of location. So, how we simplify it could be a long discussion, but really it's one vendor who can do more things for you across a combination of deployment models.
All right. Troy, one of the things that Jason alluded to in his previous comments was this need to have some kind of policy to develop almost a culture, really, for how it is that we manage cloud. So my question to you is, what should we be looking for policies in terms of developing policies? What would a good, solid enterprise policy about cloud look like? And what are the interconnection points with your non-cloud resources, right? Your own data centers. I mean, a lot of people might be using these resources for bursting capabilities, for instance, but how do we not just make this a cloud strategy, but as an architect, how do we connect this to the rest of our computing resources?
Well, so what we're seeing in this space and how they're maturing is we're seeing that the need, because of all of this agility is needed, and these applications are driving revenue within these companies, so we have to keep that agility and we have to keep that. We're having to enable these customers to become, the IT department to become a service provider, right? So the customer is, the IT group and things, we're seeing them having to take our knowledge that we've made dealing with service providers and being a cloud service provider ourselves, and setting policies within their IT organizations to make them a service provider. And once they get there, we have several companies that have a cloud-first mentality. So they want all applications on some form of cloud, and so when they have put the policies out to their organization, then when they want a new application rolled out, they have to go on the cloud, and if they don't want it on the cloud, they have to put a business case together why it won't go on the cloud. So this whole concept of the IT group being a service provider out to the company has then forced the whole company to change their policies and way of thinking, right? So it seems to work very well for those enterprises that have enabled that, and they've got the efficiencies that the cloud promises in that. Now that they're only consuming, they don't have to go to the Capitol board to get 3 to 5 years worth of hardware out there for an application that they don't know will be there 3 to 5 years from now.
One of the, I think, covering cloud, right, writing about cloud and reporting on it, it's such an imprecise term, right? So, I mean, I think the insights that you're talking about of trying to become an as-a-service provider internally to your own organizations. I've heard CIOs make the point that, look, we don't want to reinvent the wheel where resources are available elsewhere, but when we do invent the wheel, we want it to look, as you pointed out, we want it to feel like an internal cloud that is as easy to use as using an Amazon or an Azure or even a software as a service application like Workday or whatever. So my question is, do we need to be more? How well do we segment cloud policies across those private cloud environments how well do they integrate with those hybrid and public environments, and what's involved in making that? So Troy and then Jason on that. So as the
Yeah,
architect, Troy, I'll give you the first bite of the apple.
sure. So that's a great way. So with Dimension Data, our private cloud is built on the same orchestration as the public cloud, right? So we have the same APIs. The DevOps policies within the organizations can utilize the same APIs across all of the different types of cloud platforms, whether it be public cloud, private cloud hosted within the four walls of the customer's facility, or private cloud out in one of our facilities or a co-load facility. So it meshes very well, and that is a problem. That is not across the industry so far. So I believe Dimension Data is on the forefront of giving that customer the service provider tools, right? So we can put, and we're doing this right now for a customer. We're doing a data center transformation, going off of their physically owned assets onto multiple types of cloud within our environments, and giving them that automation and those tools across that to be a service provider for their customers.
Jason, what about you? As you strategically plan your relationships with customers across, to what extent do we extend the simplicity concept that you introduced in your previous remarks across these public, private, and hybrid environments?
Sure. I think to go back to your policy question and then wrap it into how we manage that within the simplification process. The real thing we try to advise our information security groups is to have an information security policy and a data classification policy that is easy for the business to understand. Because for information security departments who rely on every project team to run every project by them, that's actually what develops the shadow IT, because it's so hard to do it the correct way that people ignore it. And so instead of that, the advice we give companies is you need to make very clear policies around what data is allowed in the public cloud and what isn't, and only require a review when there's gray space. And the better you write your policy, the fewer reviews you should have. And that's a starting point. And so we work with clients to get that in place. And obviously data that's HIPAA data or PII or PCI data, those typically have private cloud requirements or very stringent security requirements in a public cloud. Both are possible, and it depends on the maturity of the organization. The second policy that we look at is a spending policy, and Troy mentioned it. And usually spend policies are very well established and exist, but they may not be entirely appropriate for OpEx purchases versus CapEx, and companies want to take a brief look at that. It's usually an easy one. The one that probably changes the most next to the data classification policy is around procurement. And when we look at how procurement works, separate from this spending authorization I'm talking about, is if you imagine a project that gets approved to push 30 servers into the cloud, there is very seldom a review process that says 6 months from now, come back and justify for me that you're still using those servers and that they're off if you're not. And while from a cloud provider, we would love to have servers never turn off. The fact is it creates problems for our clients when they forget to turn their servers off. And so what we work with our clients to do is to modify their procurement process so that there are actually triggers inside procurement that comes back and says, we will turn these servers off programmatically if you do not interject in this process and tell us you still need them, and continue your procurement approval. And that's, if we look at one of the biggest ways clients can capture savings out of a move to cloud, it's that second stage where there's a mature procurement process that goes with it that governs the use of those cloud servers so that they don't remain on after the projects are over.
So I know that in a private cloud environment, it is a bit more of a CapEx sort of an activity, but you're still utilizing resources or maybe tying up resources that could be used. Does that same model help you out in those internal implementations of some sort of an as-a-service deployment?
Absolutely, and before I give this answer, for anyone who thinks this sounds a million miles away from where they are today, I will say that that's the normal reaction, and there's a path you need to build on. But the most mature organizations we work with, and the ones where we've seen them drive 50 to 70% of the costs out of their hosting costs for their VM environments, have actually taken their approval process for a project and they put it into a tool like ServiceNow, where the project goes in with a request for a certain number of resource, and that kicks off a procurement review where the procurement team approves, let's say they approve a $20,000 project. And when 3/4 of that budget is consumed, the ServiceNow system is going to issue a ticket back out to the group saying you're about out of budget. And by the way, that could be because they've doubled the amount of resource they needed. So they're not going back to procurement saying now I need 13 VMs instead of 5. they've just deployed more resources, and the spending is all tracked within an automated system using the APIs, so that it comes back and they're saying you must now seek more approval. And they get to the point where there's so many warnings that happen, and they get to the end of that process, and if nobody's interacted, like I said before, it turns them off. And the reality is, I mean, you've probably talked to enough organizations. In a lot of cases, that's an entirely appropriate reaction. And so we build some safeguards in with our clients so that if those servers are turned off, there's a grace period even after that before they're deleted. There's a long time before it gets to be a permanent reaction. But as Troy mentioned, because we're using the same API in a private environment as we are in a public, that we actually recommend no distinction between how that process happens. So whether it's private or public resource, you should handle it exactly the same way, and you should rely on automation to drive the cost out of your business, not on people.
Troy, one of the, we can't talk about it, right? There's these converging technologies that are coming together, right? At IDC, our colleagues at IDC, I guess Gartner refers to it as, well, we refer to it as the third platform. But the idea that you have this social collaboration trend happening, that you have this mobility trend happening, and they're accessing cloud resources, that you have this big data thing happening. And big data is what I wanted to focus in on, but it's related to all those others as they lay on top of the cloud, or SMAC, right? Social, mobile, and analytics and cloud. The question is, do you want to turn off that data? Isn't all data good data? And in a private environment, storage is so cheap now, I don't know that there's any upside other than maybe from a compliance perspective. But what are your views on sort of hanging on to data, and how easy is it to do that in a private versus a public cloud environment?
Sure. So obviously, with all the buzz around big data, I believe we're still in the infancy stage on big data as well, right? Lots of talk and buzz, but actually using it, monetizing it, we're still haven't figured that out yet out there. So I think customers do want to hang on to the data right now, all of it, because they haven't figured out what to sort through and what to keep and not keep. So keeping it all, and with the price of storage right now, that is available. I think we're going to see that. We're going to see that change, that when they figure out what data to keep, they'll put policies in place to do it. I will say it's definitely easier to do that in private as well as in managed data center, right? So sometimes not even in cloud itself, but in just managed storage, right? So we're going to funnel storage off onto its own storage array through a managed data center connected to the cloud, right? So Dimension Data has managed storage as well as cloud, and so with the size of data coming in, like you said, from all those points, we're keeping it, and then we're working with partners and vendors to do the analysis, right? Using the MapRs and the Hadoops with the customers on the cloud to then start analyzing and start monetizing it to some degree, because in a lot of these companies, data is their currency. So,
Jason, I wanted to stick with this data management. You talked about data management, data policies, and classifying, and having automated ways of sunsetting them in one way or the other. But one of the observations that's been made about public cloud is that it's a bit like the Roach Motel. You can check in, but sometimes it's not so easy to check it back out. And what are your views on that, and how is that data portability issue? To what extent does that need to be understood in a mature way, and how does that fit into your overall data management strategy?
Sure. Lots of questions wrapped into that one.
Yeah.
So,
I bundled it up.
So the Roach Motel analogy, I guess I would comment that no matter whose cloud you use, it's going to be difficult to unwind from it. So everybody does some things to make it easier if that's the way you want to move out, and we standardize around VMware and in some cases Hyper-V, so you can take images out. But as anyone knows, once you're really leveraging the power of automation in cloud, you've written to a certain API set, and I would say that's just, you have to make sure you choose the right vendor before you jump in. That's a real issue. Now, the second issue around data classification and how we manage big data, I guess I would just want to make the point for anyone listening today that we work with clients across the full range of sophistication. People who have large teams of engineers who are well versed in DevOps and those really automating everything they do. And for those clients, we don't help them a lot, right? They leverage every one of the tools we bring together to implement very progressive data archiving policies, so they move data to cheaper storage once that data proves that it's no longer accessed. And on the other end of the spectrum, clients who say, you know what, we just have too much data, we can't get rid of it, like Troy was talking about, yeah, we can help them manage that and develop policies for them. So I think that wherever you are in that continuum, the automation exists underneath, and it's a question of whether you are taking advantage of it yourself as our client, or whether we're helping you take advantage of it.
Right. I guess, Jason, people get so comfortable with the consumerization of IT and how easy it seems to just set up those relationships that they forget that you do need to really. It's not a casual relationship. These relationships are going to probably matter for the foreseeable future, particularly if you start moving important production data. Is that thought? I mean, to what extent is that awareness evolving among the types of people that you're interacting with?
Well, I think it's, we operate in a certain segment of the market, and so there is a segment of the market where it's not true what you just laid out, where people just say, I'd rather never talk to my vendor and I'd rather just do it on my own. But the reasons that people come back and the relationships we have are because they're looking for someone who can manage a global network of 400 sites with first-line support for the devices that sit in their data center, as well as give them an OpEx-based public and private cloud. So we sort of limit ourselves to the conversations where people really are looking for more of a partnership relationship and a wider suite of services that extend across security and collaboration. And as you look at the enterprise market, like Troy has mentioned, between 1 and 5 billion, that's the type of customer relationship we have. So I think to the extent of the conversations we have, everyone is like that, Lane.
So Troy, let's begin our wind down process here as we get to the bottom of the hour. Tell me a little bit about best practices. How do we get started? What are your cliff notes to sort of begin thinking about? And then Jason, same question to you after Troy. But to help me put this into a context, into a framework that people can sort of step through to develop a rational, mature, risk-adjusted, multi-cloud strategy.
Sure. So I think the first thing, kind of like Jason said earlier, is to have the discussions, right? Not be set. So bring in the consultants or the experts that have understand and set these policies and help analyze the risk. As Jason said, risk being one of the really big concerns. And sit down and, like I said, the maturity of the cloud is going from dev test to production. So now's the time to say, okay, let's look at the policies. Let's look at our type of data that we have. Let's look at our security policies that we have in our data centers and in our corporation versus what can be done at a Dimension Data type company. Let's try to figure out in the multi-cloud environment. So we want cost, obviously, to be there. We want efficiency, and let's look at the multi-cloud. Where do we put our dev test, and how do we control that in the policies that we put in place? Where do we put our ERP workloads and the data that goes, and how is that connected to the cloud, right? We kind of touched earlier on, some of these companies have manufacturing that are talking to their ERP, and so how do we wrap that around to make sure it's mission critical, right? What are the SLAs around it? And so I think moving from the dev test into the full maturity cycle of all of the applications within the corporation, and it's time to start doing that, and we're seeing the CIOs understand that it's time to start doing that. So now's to have it not just in that shadow IT and that dev test and the marketing, but the full life cycle and the full suite of applications with our multi-vendor environment, public, private, offsite, onsite.
Jason, bring us home.
Bring it home. I think
no
that
pressure.
No pressure. For people watching this video, you're probably watching because you have questions about how do I mature my cloud model, or how do I get started? And I guess just to tell you a little bit about how we view that, I told you about our Simplify, Secure, and Accelerate. That's one way. But the other way we do is we come in, and what we really help clients do oftentimes at the beginning stages is saying, let's look at all my workloads. Help us figure out, what are all my workloads, and really where should they all exist? And I will tell you that you don't have to worry that we're going to come in and say they should all be Dimension Data Cloud. There are certain applications that we look at and say low value, low risk, and low cost is entirely appropriate, and we will say, that the hybrid or the commodity public cloud is a perfect place for those applications. And then we'll look at the applications which are oftentimes the most expensive and difficult to deal with that might still be running on a mainframe, and say, here's where that should sit, and here's how we can help you with that. And there's everything in between. And so, for most of our clients, or we start in that phase, the key is, getting that information, getting that understanding, and that's where we can bring the most value early, is helping to build a plan that can be communicated up to the senior levels in an organization about how to get started and how to have a 3 to 5 year cloud plan that covers everything in the portfolio. And if you look at some of the other players in the market, there are a lot of good point solutions for where they can handle one end of that spectrum or the other. And I believe we're one of the few partners that can help our clients address the entire IT footprint that they have, and that's where we will add the most value. So if that's the situation you're in, I think it'd be worth a further conversation, and that's what we do.
Well, with that, I'll let that be the last word. I want to thank you both for sharing your time with me today and for being so forthright with your comments, observations, and insights. I want to thank all of you who are tuning in for tuning in and participating in our discussion. If you have any follow-ups, please feel free to reach out to me or to our panelists to follow up. I'd certainly be interested in your feedback. Want to thank Cisco for making this series of events possible, and thank Dimension Data once again for inviting us at CIO Magazine to help facilitate this discussion. With that, I bid you all a terrific rest of your day.
Thanks, Lane.
Thanks, Lane. Bye-bye.